My name is Bob Finch, and I am the founder and president of Select Spectrum. And this is a business that was really begun in the 2.5 gigahertz band prior to starting this business really the predecessor to this business in 2009, this business in 2010. I was vice president for spectrum development at Sprint Nextel. And in that role, I was responsible for the 2.5 gigahertz band. So this is familiar to me for quite a long time now. Over the past 2.5 years, we've actually had a colleague of mine. He's recently resigned. James Bridges is his name. To pursue some other business interests closer to where he and his family live. But James had been handling this auction for that period of time. He did a super job, and I'm going to try to live up to that. But it's a great pleasure for me to once again be working in the 2.5 gigahertz band and leading this auction. And I should assure everyone that we're on the verge of hiring an additional employee who will take James' place and lead our broadband efforts, and likely actually be working with you and me on as the auction moves along beyond just receipt of first bids through the process where ultimately the participants should be able to, from the licensee perspective, complete their leases and begin receiving payments and services, and from the operator's perspective, have the chance to deploy using this licensed spectrum and the advantages that it brings. So I'm very pleased to have that plan in place, and we actually have had some great applicants for this position, so we're quite encouraged about that. As we go along today, we have a small group attending today, and so Megan is working with me. She'll be watching the screen. If you have any questions, feel free to either just type a question. You should see a little question or opportunity on your screen. If that is not there for some reason, you can click View and then Show Toolbar, and there should be a question screen. You also have the option, and I think this would work even better in this relatively small group. If you just click the hand, it should probably show red on your screen right now, indicating that you don't necessarily want to ask a question. But if you click the hand, that will turn green. Megan will notice, she'll unmute you and recognize you, and you'll have the chance to go ahead and ask your question directly. And as I said, I'd very much encourage all who are involved to ask a question, whether it's directly related to the content of the moment or more general. There are some terms and terminology in this and any other activity, and I sometimes might confuse you if I use some of those. So please jump in with any question whatsoever. Thank you, and appreciate that. So we should start, I think, with the history of the band. And it actually goes back all the way to 1963, when the Federal Communications Commission first authorized these licenses to be used for educational television service. At the time, it was called Instructional Television Fixed Service. And it was for educational television. For applications, the FCC began giving out licenses in a variety of cities. So that went on for a period of time. In the 70s, parties realized that cable TV was taking off, and there was an initiative to use these channels under lease, typically for so-called wireless cable television service. So it's very similar to the service that you'd get on your cable TV, but instead of receiving it on a physical cable, you would have an antenna outside your house. That service ultimately did not succeed financially. There were some significant efforts, but in the end, cable television and satellite TV proved to be the winners in that three-party competition. And the FCC and others decided to change the rules to recognize the increased demand that was coming for fixed connections for data services. In those days, it was the equivalent of T1s, if anyone's out of the telecommunications world, that would provide a high capacity connection to a fixed location for data. And this was the beginning days of people looking for dedicated internet access as well, typically for businesses. So those rules were changed, and again, and by the way, that's when I first got involved in the business in 1998, 1999. And the FCC then later in 2005, recognizing the interest in the mobile wireless industry and the increasing demand for mobile data, said, okay, we can also authorize these licenses for mobile wireless services. And that's when we saw significant activity from my former employer, Nextel and Sprint, to acquire these licenses. There was also a company called Clearwire, which is now folded back into Sprint, in working to acquire licenses and lease licenses. And so that has been the history of the industry so far. So we really have quite a vibrant and active business activity going on in this, and educational activity going on in this. And it's really, in my opinion, a sign of great success by the FCC, by the companies involved, by the license holders from schools, to really work out a cooperative service. It essentially does one thing in cities and a different thing in rural areas, and it supports educational services in both places. So for the 30 million plus Sprint subscribers, they all have the capability to send and receive these frequencies built into their phones. And in fact, these licenses cover the majority of Sprint's traffic nationwide. Now, predominantly, they're used in the urban and suburban areas. There's much less use by Sprint in the rural areas. And it's essentially all for mobile service as opposed to fixed. So this could be a Wi-Fi hotspot that's mobile. Mostly it is smartphones these days, but very high demand and successful business. And Sprint has built out, as you can see, to cover well over half of the U.S. population, predominantly in the cities. In addition, in a large geographic part of the country, but in a part of the country that supports a lot fewer users, a number of companies, close to 50 wireless internet service providers, sometimes called WISPs, have constructed fixed wireless networks serving schools, residences, small businesses, not with a mobile device, but with really a competition to how to provide internet to the residents. So the typical suppliers for these services are cable television in much of the area. And in other areas, we will see the telephone company provide DSL service. But realistically, this fixed wireless service is a close competitor and sometimes the only supplier of internet access in rural areas. It's much more economical over broad areas as opposed to cable or telephone DSL that requires a physical wired connection into every house. So this is, as I said, it really has become a thriving aspect of the business. So the next two slides cover where the band sits, first of all, spectrally, and second of all, geographically. So spectrally essentially is the equivalent of channels on your television set or radio. These frequencies are much higher than those frequencies. That enables them to carry, in general, since they are not only high in frequency but wide in bandwidth, they can carry typically more communications capacity than what you would see in a television or a radio signal. And they're typically, in fact, grouped in channels. So the educational channels in this band plan begin with A1, the salmon-colored license on the left, and continue all the way up to G4 near the center of the screen. And then there's an additional 16.5 megahertz of capacity that are salmon-colored and educational at the very top of the band. The blue and green colors that you're seeing on your screen are the commercial channels. These are mostly held by Sprint in urban areas, and in rural areas they might be held by Sprint or by another party. But one of the great attributes of this band is it has a lot of capacity, a lot of megahertz. And so the A block, for example, it includes A1, A2, A3 together. Each of those are 5.5 megahertz. Plus, if you look in the center of the screen, A4, an additional 6 megahertz. That's a total of 22.5 megahertz. That's a very wide channel, and it's consistent with the direction of the industry to go to wider and wider channels to support faster and faster data. And in fact, I'm now hearing that a 22.5 megahertz channel license like that may support 100 megabits or more of capacity in a typical configuration. And the expectations are that as technology evolves from 3G to 4G to 5G, the total demand or total capacity of these systems will continue to rise, and essentially to meet the demand for ever increasing amounts of data that mobile and fixed wireless customers are demanding. An interesting point about this frequency is it matches frequencies that are used in Asia by millions of subscribers, or actually hundreds of millions of subscribers there. So all of that total volume drives the overall cost of equipment down, the performance up, and that's been very positive for operators in this band, and indirectly it's very positive for license holders. So that's the spectral view of these licenses. This is a typical geographic view of the licenses. So they started as circles with a 35-mile radius. This one is shown an example in Iowa where there's no other frequencies around it, so it has the full disk. That's gotten to be rather atypical. The majority of these licenses, in fact, overlap a neighbor. And as you can see in these two licenses in Temple, Texas, and Temple, Killeen, and Waco, Texas, that where there's overlap, the two licenses basically divide the area of the overlap. And what the license holder is allowed to do, or the lessee in the case of a lease, is to build as many towers as they would like throughout that service area. There are, of course, rules in terms of maximum transmission power, but essentially they can provide a very multi-tower, high coverage kind of network throughout the full area of the license, the geographic area of the license. And sometimes we'll talk about the number of POPs. That is the number of people whose residences are within the area of any given license. That's a wireless industry term. So in terms of how these licenses are used, educational use is required, but the educator can lease out the excess capacity that they do not require for their own educational purposes. So in some cases, we actually have educational institutions that have decided to go and build their own networks and operate their own networks. Northern Michigan University has built a very extensive network in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where commercial operators have not found it economical to construct. In Kings County, California, and Albemarle County, Virginia, there are schools that are constructing their own networks to serve their own purposes. I would say that's atypical, though. The more common situation is that schools recognize that they're not experts in the business of constructing wireless networks. They're not commercial entities in general, or their activities are really focused on education. So as a result, they have decided to lease out their excess capacity and retain typically a small percentage, at least 5%, for internal use. And the way that normally works is they would sign a lease with a commercial operator. The commercial operator would build the system. The commercial operator would pay money to the educational licensee on a monthly or quarterly basis. And then the commercial operator would also provide free devices, free connections for the use of the spectrum, so that the educator got a double benefit of money plus educational use of the spectrum. And that could range from just connections, it could be for staff, it could be for lower income students who maybe couldn't afford their own, or students who lived in places where no broadband was available. It could also be a connection. We have a number of cases where two campuses are connected, and it saves the school district money that they might otherwise have to spend with a local telephone company to provide a fixed connection between two campuses. So those are the key rules. It's also worth mentioning here that although leases can now be up to 30 years, and any lease signed after 2005 could have a term of 30 years, if a party signed a lease before January 10th of 2005, then the maximum term of that lease, according to FCC rules, is 15 years. So we certainly have seen situations where an existing license holder has a lease, maybe they're not totally satisfied with it. The lease says that it's 30-year term, but then if they look and see that, for example, it was signed in 2003, then according to FCC rules, the maximum term would be 15 years. It would be expiring in 2018, this year, and that license holder would be free to renegotiate the lease with the existing tenant or to search for a new tenant. And these licenses have generally become more valuable over time, so that provides an opportunity if you hold an older license. So I mentioned that most have leased to Sprint or a mobile wireless operator. Sprint's focused in the cities. Rise Broadband, Whisper ISP are a couple of the leading companies, but there's more than 45 others that are out there providing fixed wireless service. And we've had even greater interest in that. Over 100 companies have been interested in bidding in our auctions. Why is it that these are so? Why is it that the interest is increasing? Well, one reason is that the alternative for many of these cases is essentially the Wi-Fi bands. These are unlicensed bands. They can be used by anyone. The power is very limited, but the fact that they can be used by any party also means that there's increasing amounts of radio frequency interference on these bands, and so problems can occur. We have clients who were using unlicensed spectrum successfully, and then a new operator came in. Sometimes it's the power company for meter reading, and suddenly their services are not working anymore. And in general, they find the cost of maintaining those systems to be very high. So there's a preference for licensed spectrum. That preference is increasing. One of the reasons that the demand is increasing is that the performance is improving for the equipment, the cost is going down, and I think we take partial credit as well. We've been out advocating the use of these bands really since 2010 pretty actively. That message over time has gotten through to leading suppliers. Some of the following operators, or the operators who are part of the overall pack, have seen the success of the leaders. And so we're really seeing increased interest in the spectrum from a variety of operators across the country. So to talk about the process for this auction, it is unusual, it is different. We're proud of the way this works. We think it's been successful. There's no cost to sign up, and there's effectively no significant commitment to sign up. So if you sign up and you are not satisfied with the bids that you receive for any reason, there's no obligation to go through with a transaction, and as long as no transaction is completed, you don't owe us any money for a commission. You really have the chance to evaluate the bids you get. We'll provide advice in terms of whether they are at market rates or not. We actually have a spreadsheet that we can walk you through that sort of looks at the estimated value of your spectrum. And then you and the board of your school can decide whether you want to accept any bid or not. We have completed over 90 transactions since 2014. We've got a number of other transactions that are in the works. By the way, we hope to complete these in 30 to 60 days, get a signed lease after the auction. Oftentimes it takes longer for a whole variety of reasons, many of them actually related to just explaining the process on the educational side so that it's understood. The FCC ultimately has to approve a lease as well, although that generally that is not any kind of a problem. It just takes some time. So you should expect that it will be months after the auction before you're actually in the position of collecting funds for these licenses, and that's just the nature of this somewhat complicated situation. In terms of the value, I said over 120 bidders had submitted bids in our auctions. The value ranges from 20 cents to more than, I'm sorry, from 4 cents, less than 4 cents to more than 20 cents per megahertz pop. And I'll explain what that means. That's what gallons are to gasoline, megahertz pops are to the spectrum business. So it's kind of the unit of demand that everyone looks at. So in terms of where we're offering the licenses, we showed the size of a typical license. This is physically where. Unfortunately, there are many parts of the country where we do not have any available, but you see it's pretty broadly spread. The licenses there include both places where schools have committed to offering their licenses in the auction. Now, that doesn't mean they're committed to accepting an offer. It just means that they have signed an offering agreement with us, and this is what we're asking those of you listening today to consider doing, is to sign that offering agreement. In addition, there are a number of schools where we've done research. We believe that those licenses are probably available, but we have not had success in convincing the school to sign up to officially offer their licenses in the auction. And that can be due to a variety of reasons. We think the most common is just a lack of understanding on the part of the management that we talk to at the school about what they have. And in many cases, it may be that they just don't really have a process to deal with the fact that they have this asset. And so because we've signed up the bidders, because ultimately, in all cases, really, the payment of our commission comes from the bidder, we can accept bids on those other additional licenses. We present them to the management of the license holder. And now, instead of the sort of theoretical perspective of looking at an auction where they might get a bid for their spectrum and they might make some money, now they have a legitimate offer with a fixed dollar amount and money paid over time and a number of connections, and they can evaluate the bidder or bidders. That's in the ideal situation. We have more than one bidder and really make a decision. And we very much work with the school to figure out how the process should run from the time bids are received. If they have multiple bids and they want to conduct a second round, that's fine. We get into more of a full auction perspective. If they want to accept or reject any bid, they're free to do that. So we have advice on how that's best done, but in the end, the school that holds the license gets to make the decisions. So that's how that process works. In terms of the value, what are these worth? Well, first of all, I have good news. We believe the value has come up in our last auction, and in fact, for all of the prior auctions, we had set the average value at 4 cents per megahertz pop. For the reasons I've described, we think the value has come up a little bit, 5 cents per megahertz pop. And in terms of what that means, in this example case, we found a license. I think this was in Oklahoma, 120,000 pops in the area covered by this license. That's in the range of typical in a rural or semi-rural environment. There certainly are much lower population numbers in the very rural areas and higher numbers, obviously, in a city type environment. If you take that population of 120,000 times the typical megahertz capacity of a license, then the total works out to 2.7 million megahertz pops. And 2.7 million megahertz pops times 5 cents per megahertz pop is $135,000. So since it's a lease, however, we really can't just look at the total value. We have to look at what we call the net present value. It's a way of kind of similar to a mortgage. In the case of mortgage, over time, you pay a lot more than the actual dollar value of your house, a lease would be the same thing. That $135,000 would turn into a much higher stream of payments over the full 30 years. But we discount the payments made in future years. In this case, an example value would be an upfront payment of $13,500. We always require at least 10% upfront. Frankly, that is to cover in part our commission, any other transaction costs that may come up. And then in this case, it would be payments of $782 the first year, rising by 3% each year thereafter. So that'll give you an example. I think in this case, there's a total of close to $400,000 collected over the 30-year term of the transaction. So you can get a sense of our commission, $13,500, compared to the total that the school receives of $400,000. Again, no cost to enter the auction, commission-only basis. The school is free to accept any offer or to decline any offer made. We'll work with the school to try and come up with a good transaction that makes sense. We'll support their activities in terms of board approval and so forth. And for that, we'll earn a commission that it typically works out to less than 2% of the total payments overall. In terms of the process here, the way you sign up is by signing an offering agreement. Those are available on our website. And please feel free to contact any of us on the information shown in terms of how that's done. We do have a short deadline here. I apologize for that. But we need signups by next Tuesday, April 3rd. And then that gives us time to complete all of the activities necessary to accept all bids no later than the 12th of April. That's a Thursday. So what these auctions do, we think, increase the value that you can get for your license, streamline the process, and really give you the best deal, and also a process that's clean, right? Since it's run in part by our process, it's open and understood in the industry. People can look at it and know that it's a fair process and that there's not been any favoritism on the local level. We think this altogether represents a best practice for schools holding licenses. So I do have, here's our contact information. I also wanted to announce one related item, which is that we are in the process, the FCC is in the process of looking at the rules. There's a huge number of areas, predominantly in the western part of the country, but some in the east, where no licenses are currently issued, and there's not been any licenses issued since 1995. Well, the FCC is looking at changing those rules and giving the opportunity for schools to once again apply for licenses. We're very involved in that process, in reviewing that process. We've been advocating that the FCC should go forward. There's a consensus plan supported by the National EBS Association and others that recommends how this process could be done, what the rules would be. So if you have more questions about that, we have a whole separate set of information. We'd be glad to take you through that. But if you like one license, perhaps you'd like 7 more, even better. So there's an opportunity to get multiple additional licenses. So with